in the church, had largely abolished the Gregorian chant. The fact that it was far more than 1500 years old, its origins lost in history, told against it. What the bishops forgot was that this music had sounded strange even to the ears of Charlemagne and Thomas Aquinas, Monteverdi and Haydn. It was at least as remote from their contemporary life as it is from ours, for we find it much easier to tune in to the music of other cultures than people of earlier times did. I once found myself in a beautiful little church in the Rheingau, where Gregorian chant had been given a niche as a tourist attraction, as a piece of folklore. Crowds came to this place, called Kiedrich, where the weather was fine. And in the winter, when there was fog and black ice, the large choir sang to empty pews. The Sunday excursion and wine-tasting atmosphere vanished, and the chant came out in all its purity. Perhaps it would not matter if no one came. Perhaps it would be enough if the singers sang on their own. But enough for what or who? At that stage, I did not know. Gregorian chant is music that is strictly wedded to language. Furthermore, and this is what makes it different from modern musical settings of poetry, it is wedded to a prose that is not lyrical, a prose that is sometimes quite dry. The language of the Old and New Testaments, of Paul's letters and of the Psalms, is not crafted rhythmically or otherwise fashioned according to artistic models. At the same time, the texts themselves are sacrosanct and should not be changed or edited for compositional reasons. Each word must retain its prose accent. Though Latin poetry does permit a degree of license for the sake of meter and verse. It is astonishing to become acquainted with the huge variety of melodies that are possible given such a strict set of conditions. Gregorian chant does justice to every phrase. Nothing is purely ornamental. Syllables are neither skipped over nor stretched out for the sake of the melody, as is often the case in the greatest composition from the Baroque times on. This music is like a string. It gathers itself, now flows swiftly, bubbling and gurgling, then spreads out serenely. To anyone who has listened to Gregorian chant for a considerable time, the more recent Western music is bound to sound like sterile hackwork constructed according to standard models with its mathematically calculated form, its mirror techniques, and its crab-like progress. In chant, it is as if the phrase is touched so that it sings like the string of a harp, whereas the musical settings of later arias and songs seem to be arbitrarily stuck on to the words. In Kiedrich, there was only one piece that left the words far behind, and like an ancient scat, seemed to use the words simply as a vehicle for the most beautiful long coloraturas that just did not want to come to an end. This was the Alleluia between the reading of the Epistle and Gospel. Only later did I learn from an elderly church musician that the purpose of this song, of the syllable in free flight placed between the explicit text of Revelation, was to represent the ineffability of God, transcending all words. When it came to the sermon, the priest laid his chasuble to one side of the altar, showing that his remarks were not part of the rite. He was a conservative man who loyally obeyed his progressive bishop against his own convictions. and celebrated the remodeled, amputated new rite, but in Latin, and with that sobriety he had learned in the traditional rite. After long searching, I discovered this ancient rite that, in childhood, had been a closed book to me. When I did so, it was under far from ideal circumstances, in a hideous chapel, and accompanied by chant that was woefully sung. But nonetheless, it signified the end of my Sunday morning trips to the Rheingau. In writing here of my relationship to religion, I made it a rule to say as little as possible about religion. The profession of faith that I frequently murmur to myself in Latin, or rather that I hum to myself, since I find it easier to remember it if I hum it to its melody from the Missa de Angelis, by no means contains all the things I believe. The Credo was worked out by the Church Fathers at the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople in the course of discussions that were at times extremely heated, to say the least. But for me, what comes first is a whole series of important articles of faith, carrying perhaps even more weight. The Credo is, in fact, only the capstone of my faith convictions. Thus, for instance, I believe that I am a man. I believe that the world exists. I believe that the impressions received by my eyes and ears give me adequate information about reality. I believe that a thought has just as much reality as a mountain. Everyone knows that there is no half-compelling proof for any of these articles of faith. Many of them seem to fly in the face of scientific probability. I understand very well that people have doubts about them. Sometimes I am assailed by such doubts myself. But at a deeper level of my consciousness, I brush aside all the imposing objections against the reality of the world and the reality of my own humanity, even though I cannot refute them. I am afraid I have to admit it. I am a Stone Age man. I have not succeeded in reconciling my intellectual concepts with my fundamental convictions, which are deeply rooted in the physical. I ought to have accepted long ago that I live in a chaos, that there is nothing in me that can say I, apart from some neural reflex, and that every sense impression of this non-existent I rests only on illusion and deception. Nevertheless, when I hear the blackbird's evening song, which, as we all know, is not a song but a sonic development favorable to evolution, and when I hear the distant clang of the church bell sounded by a machine that strikes a piece of bronze on the clapper, I hear these things as a message, undecipherable maybe, that is meant for me. People say, and I should have grasped it long ago, that the objects surrounding me have not the slightest significance, that there is nothing in them. And what I see in them is what I read into them, and who after all am I? Yes, I hear all this, but I do not believe it. I am still on the very lowest rung of the history of mankind.